Hey everyone, this is Mike. Today I'm going to be doing the rotation guide on Warrior. If you've seen yesterday's video on Gunbreaker, this is pretty much going to be the same thing, so you kind of know what to expect. Now, Warrior, just like Gunbreaker, works in a 3-minute rotation, but instead of it being divided in 3 1-minute parts, it's divided in 2 90-second parts. And that's because of how the inner release is 90 seconds and it takes a full 3 minutes for it to realign with how Infuriate works. So if you played Warrior back in Stormblood, the Shadowbringers Warrior is very similar to it, but the biggest change is that Infuriate now has 2 charges and also gives you the Nascent Chaos buff, which then gives access to Inner Chaos or Chaotic Cyclone, which are your 2 strongest abilities for both single target and AoE. Now, because Inner Release makes it so that all of your attacks direct hit crit, and your Inner Chaos and Chaotic Cyclone are also guaranteed direct hit crits, it means that you never want to use Infuriate during your Inner Release, which sometimes you would Infuriate during Inner Release back in Stormblood, because Infuriate only had that 1 charge, so you wanted to use it whenever it was up. Right now though, it has 2 charges, so it means that you can store a charge for like a buff window or something like that. For example, in the rotation that I'm going to be showing you, it's basically going to line up with every trick attack, and since trick attack is 1 minute, it's pretty much also going to be following up with some other stuff, like for example, you have, I believe Astrologian is 2 minutes, I'm going to check real quick. Yeah, Divination is 2 minutes. So if it lines up with trick attack, it lines up with Divination, it lines up with Embolden from Red Mage, I think it's called Embolden. But yeah, anyways, so that's kind of what I'm going to be showing you today. Basically, every other inner release is going to line up with your 3-minute buffs. Of course, Warrior doesn't really care about most of the 3-minute buffs, because those are things like Battle Voice, Litany. Warrior doesn't really care about those two. But all of your other stuff like Trick Attack, Brotherhood, Divination at 6 minutes again as well, and your other 2-minute buffs. But then again, like every time that we do not have an inner release for those buffs, like Trick Attack, Divination, etc., we are going to have 2 Inner Chaoses, a Fell Cleave, and also an Upheaval. So Warrior works around 4 different resources, I guess we'll call them for now. So we have our Inner Release and our Infuriate, those are 2 of them. The third one is their Beast Gauge. This is something that fills over time by executing certain combos, but also by using your Infuriate. And you basically just want to make sure that you do never overcap it, but you also want to make sure that you have enough gauge so that you're basically can use your Upheaval on cooldown. Now, a very important change going from Stormblood into Shadowbringers is that your Beast Gauge does not give you crit rate anymore. Back in Stormblood, when you were in Deliverance, you would get crit rate depending on how much Beast Gauge you have. But now basically Beast Gauge is just a number, it doesn't have crit rate attached to it anymore. So there are certain parts in the rotation where I'm going to be dumping it all the way to 0, just to make my reapplication of our next buff a lot better. Final buff that we have is Storm's Eye. This is 30-second damage buff. Basically, you just want to reapply this as late as possible, and you want to have 100% uptime of this to do as much damage as you can. Now, the really cool thing about Storm's Eye is that the 2 combos of Warrior basically go off the first same 2 skills. You have Heavy Swing, Maim, and then you choose to go either Storm's Eye to reapply your Storm's Eye buff, or you go Storm's Path to go for the extra Beast Gauge generation. Now, the kind of rule that I set around this is really simple. So, if you have more than 8 seconds, you use Storm's Path. If you have 8 seconds, and you do not need to use a Fell Cleave to dump gauge, you use Storm's Path. If you have less than 8 seconds, you use Storm's Eye. That's kind of how I look at it, and when I do the rotation myself later, and I'll do some commentary over it, I'll also be pointing out those parts where I'm like, well, I have 8 seconds on Storm's Eye, so I'm going to be using a Storm's Path because I don't need to use a Fell Cleave to dump gauge, so I can just do another Storm's Eye combo before my buff will drop. Warrior also plays around with the fact that when a buff drops during the GCD, it still applies to it. So as long as you press the GCD when the buff is active, even though the buff drops while you're executing the GCD, it'll still count as if it was there because of server ticks and that kind of stuff. So those are kind of the principles. Infuriate, never let it never let it overcap to 2 charges. Never use it right before your inner release, because if you use it right before your inner release, you want to dump that Nascent Chaos buff first before you go into inner release, because otherwise that's a very big damage loss. And then of course Storm's Eye application and your Beast Gauge. So let's go into the opener real quick. Warrior has definitely got the easiest opener out of pretty much any job in the game, I think, apart from maybe like a white mage or whatever. But basically it's very simple. You're going to be doing a Storm's Eye combo to get your Storm's Eye buff ready. You're going to be pressing Infuriate as soon as you can, because you can only execute it in combat, of course, so you do need to be in combat before you can use it. After that Storm's Eye combo, we're going to be dumping our Nascent Chaos buff before we go into our inner release, because as I said, if you go into inner release with your Nascent Chaos buff, you're going to be losing a lot of damage. You go into inner release, you dump your Upheaval, Onslaught, you Fell Cleave a bunch, and then at the end we're going to finish it with one more inner Chaos and an Onslaught. Now that one Onslaught is basically there to dump that 20 resting gauge that we're going to be having from doing our initial Storm's Eye combo. That's also the only Onslaught that we're going to be doing outside of inner release, because basically Onslaught is the worst damaging spell that you can spend your gauge on, basically. The way it works with your beast gauge is Upheaval is the best one, so you always want to have gauge ready to use Upheaval on cooldown. If you misalign your Upheaval as well, so basically if you use it too late a few times, it's going to get misaligned with your inner release, and that's going to be a big damage loss if you can't use Upheaval inside inner release. So you definitely want to make sure you keep that on cooldown as much as you can. Now other than this, basically your cooldown, like your rotation flows really well without having to use Onslaught at all. Now of course there are certain fights where you have downtime, and of course where you will need to disengage from the boss, so of course this only works in a dummy scenario, and you will have to adjust a little bit on a fight by fight basis. So Onslaught is still very useful, especially as a gap closer. If you do have a fight where, for example, you have downtime like Leviathan, I think the only fight that doesn't have downtime in this raid tier is E2 Savage, pretty much. And there's still a disconnect there as well, where you have to run away from the flare marker and stuff like that. So Onslaught is still very useful as a gap closer, but outside of that, if you have something with downtime and there is a part where you have leftover gauge and you don't really have a way to spend it efficiently, you can basically use Onslaught to dump gauge as well. It's not really super efficient, but if you're somebody like me that gets a bit autistic about your rotation, and having Onslaught to dump your gauge is something that can be pretty useful in certain scenarios as well. But in general, try to use Onslaught as little as possible, because it is the lowest damaging thing that you can spend your beast gauge on, basically. So yeah, that is that. Now, that's pretty much the opener. This is also going to set us up for the rest of the fight. Now, if you take a look at the 1 minute parts in the rotation as well, basically, if you know when the trick attack is gonna happen, or well, basically when the 1 minute parts in the rotation are, it's also going to be easy to keep track of your Infuriate, because Infuriate is a very weird interaction now, because you have that extra charge of it. And at first I was kind of struggling with where I should use this, but basically, if you always align it with your 1 minute buff window of that trick attack, that embolden, that divination, you're always going to be fixing your rotation that way as well. So basically we're always going to save one charge and then a 55-second cooldown, meaning that you only have like 5 seconds left, about 10 to 5 seconds left on your cooldown of your second charge. And then we're going to basically be dumping a Fell Cleave, we're going to use Infuriate, Inner Chaos, we're going to use Infuriate again, second Inner Chaos, during every single trick window, and this will also fix our rotation. So let's take a look at the actual rotation now, and we'll kind of go from there. So first of all, as I said, we're going to be doing our Storm's Eye combo, and of course activating Infuriate for that Inner Chaos. Going to be using Inner Release in the second half of our GCD, because otherwise we're not going to fit all 5 GCDs inside our Inner Release window, especially if you have a slower GCD. The higher your GCD is, the easier it becomes for you to fit all your GCDs in. If you're looking for the perfect GCD, it is a 2.38 GCD, if I am not mistaken. Now here, as you can see, we're going to reapply our Storm's Eye just as the buff drops. So this is kind of what I was talking about earlier as well. If you know you don't need the Fell Cleave, you can just basically do another Storm's Path to get extra beast gauge. And then from here, it's basically like Warrior is relatively simple when it comes down to the GCDs that we're pressing. Gunbreaker is really busy when it comes down to off global cooldowns. As you can see here, 8 seconds on Storm's Eye, gonna use a Storm's Path, and then by the time we have our Storm's Eye again, it's basically going to refresh the buff just as it drops. Now on this one we're going to have a trick attack window, so we're going to Upheaval, Fell Cleave, use Infuriate just before we get that second stack, double Infuriate for the 2 Inner Chaoses, and then we can finish it off with another Fell Cleave. This is especially good now because trick attack is now 15 seconds instead of just the 10, so this is something that's possible now. As I said before, 8 seconds on Storm's Eye, so we can do a Storm's Path combo, Storm's Eye right before it finishes, and then we can go back into our next inner release. Now the next phase is going to look slightly different again, of course, because trick attack is now just about 30 seconds away, meaning that the next time that we use our Upheaval is basically going to be when trick attack is. This is kind of how you can keep track of trick attack, is with your Upheaval charges. I'm going to dump my gauge here a bit. Of course, if you have a longer cooldown on your Storm's Eye, you can kind of use a Fell Cleave to dump your gauge instead, to kind of extend the duration that your Storm's Eye buff is still going for. And then we do Upheaval, Fell Cleave, double Inner Chaos, during which would be a trick window. We don't have a fourth Fell Cleave for this one, or a second Fell Cleave I guess you could say, so that one's kind of unfortunate. Now for this one, I'm going to be dumping my whole gauge to get a better Storm's Eye reapplication again. And it doesn't really matter that we dump all of our gauge here, because as you can see with the MAME, we're going to have enough beast gauge to use that Upheaval on cooldown as it becomes ready to us. And it'll basically make it so that our rotation just flows that bit better. And then here we're going to be coming up on our 3-minute window. Again, as you can see, we have 8 seconds left on that Storm's Eye buff, meaning that I can use a Fell Cleave before reapplying it. Storm's Eye to get the buff again, and then we just go into our next inner release window. And that's pretty much that. At the end of this one, we are going to be using our Infuriate again to get that on cooldown. And I'll keep going for the next 1 minute until we get up to our next trick window again, to show you that we did now fully complete our cycle, so to speak. 8 seconds, so I can dump with a Fell Cleave. And it basically, the rotation just repeats itself from here. So this Upheaval is going to be outside of the trick. And the next one that we get is going to be inside the trick attack window. So for that next trick window, we are gonna have 2 Fell Cleaves, an Upheaval, and 2 Inner Chaoses again. And it basically just repeats itself from there. Storm's Eye at 8, so we're gonna do a Storm's Path. Refresh our Storm's Eye, and then we're gonna go to 100 gauge, and then we're gonna dump everything inside what would be the next trick attack window. So Fell Cleave, Upheaval, Inner Chaos, second Inner Chaos, Storm's Path to get the final piece of gauge, and then another Fell Cleave, and that would be the end of your trick window. So that's pretty much the 3-minute rotation. I went a little bit longer than just 3 minutes to show you that it does align everything again. So basically it's really simple. First you have your inner release, then the next time you dump your Infuriate charges is at 1 minute, then you have your next inner release, then you dump it 30 seconds after that inner release, because that's when the next trick window would be. Then the next inner release is during a trick window, so you have your inner release during the trick, meaning that you want to dump your Infuriate immediately after the inner release, and then it basically just resets itself, because that was your opener again, sort of. So yeah, that's pretty much how the warrior rotation flows. If you have any more questions, feel free to ask them in the comments. Of course, as I said, it varies on a fight-by-fight basis. This is only in a dummy scenario, of course. So there's a lot of optimization that can be done around your beast gauge, as well as your Storm's Eye reapplication and your Infuriates, when it comes to fights that do have downtime. So yeah, Ward is a pretty cool job. Varies from fight to fight, unlike Gunbreaker. Gunbreaker is pretty much a static job that always does the same every fight almost. But Warrior, there's a lot of variation in what you can do and how you want to pull your buffs and your stronger skills towards buff windows for the rest of the party as well. So yeah, that's pretty much it for me. I hope you learned something, and I'll see you in the next one.